Hello, and welcome to GBE Business Digest. In today's episode, we're diving into open source intelligence, or OSINT. Let's get started.
Ever try to solve a puzzle, but the pieces are scattered all over the internet? That's kind of what today's deep dive is all about. We're talking open source intelligence, OSINT for those in the know, and how customs agencies are using it to crack down on smuggling.
It's like the future of investigations is happening right now,
Yeah.
and it all starts with information that's publicly available.
And not just your average Google search, right? We're talking sifting through mountains of data, social media chatter, those crazy detailed trade databases. Even satellite images are fair game. Remember that company? The one busted for using sneaky labeling tricks to dodge millions in taxes? Yeah, OSINT was a key player in that whole thing.
It's all about connecting the dots, and sometimes those dots are hidden in the most unexpected places. Take Operation Cosmo, for instance. Huge global operation. 114 countries working together, all using OSINT to track down illegal shipments of seriously dangerous stuff. We're talking the kind of materials that could end up in the wrong hands.
Okay, now that's what I call high stakes. 114 countries. So this isn't just about catching someone sneaking an extra bottle of booze through customs anymore, huh?
Not even close. The World Customs Organization, they put out a report that we're going to really dig into today. And one of the big takeaways is this. We're talking about strategic goods, things that could destabilize entire regions if they fall into the wrong hands.
Okay, now I see why this matters for everyone, not just folks with the badge. I mean, think about all the stuff we buy online these days. Counterfeit goods, shady supply chains. OSINT helps keep all that in check, right?
Absolutely. Remember that whole thing about counterfeit electronics being passed off as medical supplies? Costs some countries millions, not to mention the potential risk to people's health. OSINT is becoming essential not just for fair trade, but for safety too.
So it's like having a global watchdog making sure the flow of goods is, on the up and up. Okay, we've established this is big stuff, but let's get into the nuts and bolts. How is OSINT actually used by customs? It's more than just one thing, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. One of the biggest things is threat identification and risk assessment. Think of it like an early warning system, right? Monitoring social media, news, even things like weather patterns. It all helps customs get ahead of potential smuggling operations.
So say a hurricane slams into a major port. Suddenly there's a huge demand for building materials. They can see that coming and watch for any unusual activity.
Exactly. It's all about spotting those patterns, those little shifts that could mean something's up. And it's not just what's being shipped, but who's behind it, their history, their connections, creating a risk profile, basically.
Like piecing together a puzzle, but instead of 1,000 pieces, it's like a zillion data points. And speaking of data points, the report also goes into how customs uses OSINT for trade compliance and fraud detection.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. We're talking about verifying documents, making sure what's being shipped matches what's declared, even untangling those crazy money laundering schemes.
It's wild what kind of trail you can follow with digital breadcrumbs.
Tell me about it. The report highlights this one case they used OSINT to connect the dots between shell companies, fake invoices, suspicious bank transfers. It all led back to a massive smuggling ring.
Okay, that is some next-level detective work. And speaking of exciting cases, the report also dives into something called Operation Cosmo.
Yeah, Operation Cosmo, that was something else. Basically, it was a huge global effort to stop the illegal trade of, those really bad things, the ones we talked about, with the potential to cause serious harm.
Right, the chemical, biological, nuclear stuff. Didn't the report say over 100 countries were involved?
114, to be exact. Can you imagine the coordination? And it was largely through OSINT that they were able to track these materials, identify the networks involved, really disrupt their whole operation.
So they weren't just reacting after the fact. They were using OSINT to be proactive, anticipating threats. That's incredible. But the report also mentioned some of the challenges. It can't all be smooth sailing, right?
Oh, there are definitely challenges, big ones. One of the biggest has to do with just the sheer amount of data out there. Think about it. Every tweet, blog post, online transaction, it's a potential data point.
It's like they say, trying to find a needle in a haystack, except this haystack is like the entire internet.
Pretty much. And then there's the whole issue of verifying information. With all the disinformation and fake news out there, you got to be sure what you're basing your decisions on is legit.
So how do they do that? Is there special software for that, or teams of super sleuth, verifying every little thing?
It's a little bit of both, actually. They do have software that can sift through and analyze data, but ultimately it comes down to human analysts. These are people with specialized training who can see patterns, connect the dots, separate real from fake.
So even with all this amazing tech, good old-fashioned human intelligence is still essential.
100%. And of course, the human element comes with its own challenges, things like bias, misinterpreting information. The report really stresses the importance of proper training, ethical guidelines for anyone using these tools.
Makes sense, with great power, right. But isn't it true that it's not just governments using OSINT anymore?
Oh, not at all. These days, you've got journalists using it for investigations, businesses using it for market research, even regular people, just to learn more about, well, pretty much anything.
I've even heard of people using it to, check out their dates online. Which, I mean, a little creepy, but also kind of smart. But on a serious note, it's pretty wild how accessible this information is becoming.
It's a double-edged sword, that's for sure.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it gives individuals incredible power, access to information they never would have had before. But it also raises questions about privacy, the potential for misuse.
Right, and as we create even more data, those concerns are only going to get bigger.
Absolutely. That's something else the report touches on. This need for a constant conversation about the ethics of OSINT. How do we balance security with privacy in this digital age? It's a tough one.
Okay, we've talked about the challenges, but let's get back to the successes for a sec. Besides Operation Cosmo, what are some other examples of customs using OSINT effectively?
Oh, there are tons. The report mentions one case where they were able to bring down a whole smuggling ring. These guys were using a network of shell companies to import counterfeit goods.
Classic move. Shell companies, always got to be those, right? But how do they crack it?
Well, customs officials, they used OSINT to follow the money, basically. Track financial transactions, figured out who was involved, built a rock-solid case. It was a textbook example of how you can use OSINT to expose these complex financial crimes, bring the bad guys to justice.
So we've got catching smugglers, fighting terrorism, tackling financial crime. OSINT is like the ultimate multi-tool for law enforcement. But it's not all about catching criminals, right? There are other benefits.
You're right. One of the big ones is just improving how efficiently customs agencies can operate.
How so? Give me an example.
Well, some agencies are now using OSINT to streamline how they assess risk. By analyzing data from a bunch of different sources, they can quickly identify high-risk shipments, which frees up resources so they can focus on the biggest threats.
So it's not just about working harder, it's about working smarter. I like it. Didn't the report also mention something about training?
They did. Training is becoming more and more important in the world of OSINT.
What kind of training are we talking here? Were they sending all these agents off to, secret spy schools?
Not quite spy school, but it's pretty high-tech. A lot of agencies have developed sophisticated training programs that teach officials how to find, analyze, and make sense of all this open-source data.
So it's kind of like flight simulation, but for customs agents. They can practice online, test out different strategies, all in a safe environment.
You got it. They even run simulations based on real-world scenarios. So they're learning how to spot forged documents, track smuggled goods online, all virtually before they ever have to do it in the field.
That's amazing. All this talk about technology, data, sophisticated techniques, it really makes you wonder how big of a role is OSINT playing in the overall fight against smuggling. Is it a small but growing part of the equation, or is it becoming more central?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the report actually addresses that directly. And what they argue is this. OSINT isn't just useful, it's becoming absolutely essential for customs agencies.
So this isn't just a fad, it's here to stay.
No doubt about it. And as we generate more and more data, as the ways we can analyze that data get more advanced, OSINT is only going to become more powerful, more important.
It's like we're entering a whole new era of intelligence gathering. And the answers are often right there, hiding in plain sight, if you know how to look.
Exactly. But we can't forget about the human element either. The report emphasizes that too. It's one thing to have the tools, but you have to know how to use them responsibly, ethically.
A good reminder for all of us, right? No matter what kind of tools we're talking about. But before we move on, I'm curious about the international cooperation aspect. Earlier, you mentioned Operation Cosmo, which involved over 100 countries. Is that level of collaboration common in the world of OSINT?
It's becoming more and more common, and for good reason. Smuggling is a global issue. Criminals, they don't exactly respect borders, so to combat them effectively, customs agencies need to work together, share information, coordinate their efforts.
Makes sense. But how does that collaboration actually work? Are there, like, international organizations or agreements in place that facilitate all this sharing of information?
Absolutely. There are a number of frameworks in place. The World Customs Organization, for example, they're a big player in this. They promote cooperation, sharing of best practices among member countries. They've even got a working group specifically dedicated to OSINT.
So it's not just everyone fending for themselves. There's structure, there are rules of the road.
Exactly. And a lot of countries have their own bilateral or multilateral agreements that allow them to share intelligence about smuggling and other crimes, which is important because trust is paramount.
Right. One country needs to be able to trust that the information they share with another is going to be handled appropriately.
100%. And it needs to be done legally, ethically, all that good stuff, because ultimately, this information sharing, it's about keeping people safe.
And that brings up an interesting point. We started this whole deep dive talking about OSINT as a tool to fight smuggling. But it's clearly much bigger than that. It's almost like a new way of looking at the world, a way of understanding complex systems, making sense of all the data that's constantly bombarding us.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it. OSINT isn't just about catching criminals, it's about understanding how things work, using that knowledge to make more informed decisions.
And as our world becomes increasingly interconnected, as those lines between the physical and digital blur even more, that understanding is only going to become more valuable. More important.
Couldn't agree more. We're all part of this global network now, and frankly, OSINT is one of the keys to navigating it successfully.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our OSINT journey. All right, so we're back, ready to wrap up this deep dive into OSINT. And, we've talked about what it is, how it's used, why it matters. But one thing I'm curious about is, well, who are the major players in this world? It's not just, like, government spies with trench coats and sunglasses.
Oh,
right.
Definitely not just trench coats and sunglasses, although I'm sure those exist somewhere. But seriously, it's a pretty diverse landscape. You've got your government agencies, customs, obviously, but also intelligence services, law enforcement. They're all using OSINT in different ways. But then you've also got private companies getting in on the action. Security firms, risk management consultants, even marketing and PR agencies are using OSINT these days.
Wow, so it's a real mix of public and private sector.
Yeah.
What about universities? Are they involved in the OSINT world at all?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of cutting-edge research is happening at universities, developing new OSINT tools, techniques, and of course, training the next generation of analysts.
So it's like this whole ecosystem is growing around OSINT, which makes sense given how important it's becoming. But I'm wondering, how do all these different players work together? Is it a coordinated effort or more like everyone doing their own thing?
It's a little of both, to be honest. There are formal channels of collaboration, like information sharing agreements between agencies, international organizations that set standards, that sort of thing. But then there's also a lot of informal networking happening, people connecting at conferences, online forums, just sharing ideas and best practices.
So combination of structure and like organic collaboration.
Yeah.
Which I guess makes sense, keeps things flexible in a field that's constantly evolving.
Exactly. And it allows for a lot of different perspectives, different approaches, which is crucial in a field as complex as OSINT.
Totally. So for our listeners out there who are now like totally hooked on OSINT, what's one thing they could do if they want to learn more, maybe even dip their toes into this world?
Well, the good news is there's no shortage of resources out there.
Yeah.
Tons of great stuff online, everything from beginner guides to super advanced training programs. A good place to start is the OSINT Foundation. They've got a ton of info, and they're a well-respected organization.
I've heard of them. And there are also like online communities, forums where people share tips, right?
Totally. Great way to connect with other OSINT enthusiasts, learn from each other. Because honestly, the best way to learn OSINT is just to dive in and start experimenting.
I love that. And the cool thing is OSINT is a skill set that's useful in so many areas, not just like national security stuff. Whether you're into journalism, business, or just want to be more informed about the world, OSINT has something to offer.
100% agree. It's about empowering yourself with information, which is something we can all get behind.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this epic deep dive into the world of open source intelligence. We've covered a ton of ground today, from the basics to the future of OSINT. And, I gotta say, this is one of those topics that just makes you realize how much the world is changing, how much information is out there just waiting to be discovered.
It's definitely a fascinating time to be in this field.
And for our listeners, if you're as intrigued by OSINT as we are, we encourage you to check out the show notes. We'll be sure to link to all the resources we mentioned, plus some bonus materials to satisfy your OSINT curiosity. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one uncovering the next big story using nothing but open source intelligence. Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay informed.
Thank you for listening to this episode of GBE Business Digest. If you found this information useful and would like to stay updated with the latest business insights, make sure to subscribe, activate the bell, and visit the Carlos Bastida website to explore his portfolio of services. The link is in the description. Let's work together to take your business to the next level.